Hello, Rolando and I have been asked to talk about Strand 4, which is Assessment and Accountability from the Guiding Principles for Dual Language Education. Assessment and accountability are vital to any dual language program or any bilingual program. The student achievement data is collected and it is used to monitor the instructional programs as they are operating to be sure that they are aligned with the goals and with the mission statement. Also, the student achievement data is used to shape the instructional programs, any changes that are necessary in order to realign or to maximize growth for the students. Any dual language or bilingual program is not stagnant, and it needs to change and evolve over time to reflect best practice for these particular school with those particular students. A main concern that was addressed in our strand was how to assess a dual language program, how to assess those students. It was noted that the large-scale standardized tests, they do not demonstrate mastery of a concept. They are designed to demonstrate mastery of language skills. And so they can only show that if the student is given the test in English and they master the test, then clearly their English language skills were at a high level to be able to do that. If they are still at a lower level of acquisition, they're not going to master the test because they can't manipulate through the language skills in order to be successful with it. The second point that was brought up is that tests that require familiarity with technology or computer-based testing, which is something that we see now that students are able to take tests on the computers, they're not sure exactly how it is affecting English language learners and low-income students, because these students, by and large, do not have those resources available to them, and so they're not as familiar with using technology and with manipulating it and moving themselves around in it. Therefore, their success rate is going to be much lower. One of the accountability problems with dual language that was addressed in our strand was that students must demonstrate mastery of grade level content. We know from our previous readings with Thomas and Collier that native English speakers, it takes them 1 to 2 years to catch up with their native English speaking peers. Now, the English language learners, it takes them up from 5 to 7 years to close that achievement gap based on the graph that we had analyzed. It takes up to 5 to 7 years for them to close that achievement gap to show mastery of grade level content. Curriculum-based measures are measures of a student's performance in either basic skills or in content knowledge, such as reading, writing, spelling, and math skills. You'll notice on the right hand of this slide, curriculum-based measures are meant to go over time to show growth. And so you'll notice that there is a graph, graphing, charting, student data, their progress as they are moving along for whatever the measure was on that particular graph. There is evidence that suggests that these curriculum-based measures are valid and reliable predictors of reading outcomes for our language learners. The main concern that was noted here is that the curriculum-based measures are often administered only in English. There were some identified points for the appropriate use of measures with language learners in particular, and they suggested using tools that were already demonstrated in reliability and validity in order to identify students' needs for instructional support in L1 and L2, and to do continual monitoring of their needs in both languages. Assessing the students' language skills should happen in order to provide an appropriate context regarding their current levels of performance as they're moving along, to be tracking their data to show and make sure that you have that upward slope on the graph to make sure that they are growing in both languages. Another point they talked about was the acquisition of first and second language and tracking those against each other to make sure that there was adequate growth there, and also that the instructional planning should be driven by these, that you're going to meet the student on their instructional level, that it's not going to be too high or too low, but it's going to be right on their instructional level to show maximum growth. There were 2 effective data practices that were identified in our strand. One of them said that effective schools use assessment measures that are aligned with the school's vision and goals and with appropriate curriculum and related standards, so that everything is all aligned. The second point was that it's important to disaggregate the data to identify and solve issues of curriculum, assessment, and instructional alignment for accountability purposes. So it's important to go through the data to make sure that we understand what is happening in our program, to make sure that their curriculum is the best and the most effective it needs to be, that we are assessing correctly, and that our instruction is aligned not only to our vision and goals, but also to the best outcome for our students. Dual language programs require the use of multiple measures in both languages to assess the student's progress toward meeting the goals that are outlined, such as bilingualism, biliteracy, curricular goals, and content-related goals. 2 points that were addressed is that it should test content and literacy in the partner language, and it is also important to ensure that assessments in the partner language are not simply translations of assessments in English, so that the assessments are truly authentic and not just regurgitated from the opposite language, so that you can actually see that there is cognitive processes happening and that they are showing their proficiency. One of the important parts in our strand was the teacher's ability to evaluate English learner assessments. They talked about teachers who lack sufficient knowledge of an English language learner assessment. They are likely to have their students doing work that is either too easy or too difficult. And on the flip side, talked about teachers who have an expert knowledge and skill level at English learner assessments, that they can provide work that is at the instructional level of the student, meets them where they are, so that they can have the most efficient teaching and learning. 2 of the best practices that were identified were assessing academic achievement by looking at students' performance in both languages and watching their slope on their growth in both languages, and also to use side-by-side assessments. Another important issue that was addressed was the diagnosis of students that might have a language impairment, students that are in the dual language program. And so it was also noted that the language impairments will show up in both languages, not just in one, and that if you have a student who is having a slower development than normal in only one of the languages, then it usually reflects that their quality and their quantity of opportunity to learn in that language has been compromised in some way due to some other factor. But if a student has a language impairment, then it's going to show up in both languages. One of the key ideas behind interpreting the assessment data is to verify that, in fact, the dual language program is meeting the 3 core goals of bilingualism or biliteracy, high academic achievement in both program languages, and sociocultural competence. Our strand talked about that the assessment plans also need to include ways to measure a student's sociocultural competency and their development, because it is one of the 3 main goals of a dual language program. The other point that they talked about again was, in order for the administrators and teachers to appropriately interpret the data, they must receive professional development that is focused specifically on assessment, which should also include the interpretation of the assessment data. This is something that is incredibly important to make sure that you're being faithful to the program, is to make sure you really understand what you're assessing and what you're looking at, so that you know how to move forward. Because of the significance of assessment for both accountability and for evaluating the program, for the purpose of evaluating the program, it is important to establish a data management system that tracks students over time. Assessment is carried out in consistent and systematic ways and is aligned with appropriate standards and goals. Assessment outcomes are interpreted correctly and disseminated to appropriate constituents. Professional development is provided to enable teachers to develop, collect, and interpret assessment data appropriately and accurately. The last point that our strand talked about was the availability of a budget. They said that it is important that a budget be available, and it is also required to allow the staff to align the assessment component with the visions and goals of bilingualism, biliteracy, academic achievement, and sociocultural competence, which are the main goals of a dual language program. Thank you for listening to our presentation.